So hi, good morning. Good morning to all those on the Pacific Coast. Good afternoon to all of those on the East Coast. My name is Andre Gonawala. I am a program analyst with BMNT. I've been working on this panel along with Ellen Chang, who will be your host today. And just want to say welcome to the race for autonomy and navigating a new battlefield. This is going to be the first conversation in a longer series of conversations. And essentially what we want to do here is by having this general conversation, we want to seize the opportunity for private-public collaboration in the autonomy and defense space. We want to have an open and frank conversation on the state of autonomy in defense and how we can actually enhance collaboration and potentially address any existing gaps. Of course, we're going to be asking a lot of questions and certainly we'll be getting a lot of answers, but some of those answers may spawn new questions, may spawn deeper conversations and so on, which we will seek to address in our follow-up conversations. We're so pleased to be joined by four great leading experts, Lieutenant General Jack Shanahan, who is the former director of Joint AI Center, Christine Moon, who is the co-founder and president of BlueSpace.ai, Ikram Mansori, who is the leading innovation and security expert, and Dr. Deji, who is the Autonomy Portfolio Manager from the Office of Naval Research. We'll be recording this session so you can share it out with your teams and whoever else you'd want to share it out with, and it'll be posted on YouTube. But for now, thank you so much and welcome. Ellen, I guess I'll throw it over to you.
Yeah, thanks for that great introduction, Andre. And to the panelists as well as the audience. Well, I guess let me back up. I'll introduce myself. My name is Ellen Chang. I'm a Vice President of Ventures at BMNT. It's an interesting title. I get to do a lot of different things. One of our ventures is how, helping have concerted conversations around key topics, as Andre mentioned, in order to involve a diverse audience. So not just a diverse panel where we have Christina Moon, who's from the commercial sector, and we have Dr. Deji Coker, who is from the research organization of the Navy. We really want to mix and match and have cross-disciplined conversations in order to get at really hard problems. We came up with this topic area because we thought it was important to differentiate autonomy from AI, which many folks conflate together. And incidentally, Dr. Horowitz, who is now with the Office of Secretary of Defense and Emerging Technology Policy, basically started to say that the Department of Defense is starting to review its purview over artificial intelligence technologies as well as autonomy. So with that, what I would like to do is take a little bit of time for each of our panelists to introduce themselves, and then I'll seed the questions to get our conversation going. But for the audience online, please don't hesitate to put questions in the chat room. And Andre and Donna, who is also one of our analysts, will help us flesh them out so that we can get those questions asked. So with that, let me start. General Shanahan, would you start and introduce yourself and how you relate or think about autonomy as well?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Jack Shanahan. I retired from the Air Force in the summer of 2020. My last two positions were I stood up what's called Project Maven, or in its more formal title, the Algorithmic Warfare Cross-Functional Team, which says something about the future of algorithmic warfare and autonomous systems. And then in my last assignment before I retired, I stood up the DoD Joint AI Center, or the JAIC, and then used my GI Bill for another 2 years to get another master's degree at NC State University, which I just finished. And now I'm involved in a variety of different sort of subjects, workshops, committees, some of which have to do with this very subject, including one with the IEEE, Standards Association, Autonomous Weapons Systems, Assurance and Safety Subcommittee, which is exactly this topic. So in terms of autonomous systems, what I'll just say very briefly is I'm so wary about ever using the term inevitability when it refers to humans in conflict, because war is still going to be chaos, confusion, friction, and unpredictability. However, the trend lines are increasingly clear that autonomous systems will be an important component, not only of warfare, but of society over the next 5 to 10 years. And we're seeing that play out in places like Ukraine today, but in the commercial industry as well. And some of you may have heard the acronym SUMS, of small, unmanned, many, and smart. And I would throw another S into there, which is swarming. The trends are all pointing in this direction. The question is, what do we as humans do to set the conditions for this future of AI-enabled autonomous systems. Or, Ellen, to your point, I hear this conflation all the time, autonomous systems versus AI-enabled autonomy. They are very different, and we need to be clear when we're talking about one versus the other. So I'll stop there and turn it back to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. I'm going to go to Ikram. Would you give us your background?
Absolutely. It's such an honor being here. Hello, everybody. I'm actually in Paris. I just left Cannes for the Lion Festival, and I'm in Paris, and really happy to be here. Army veteran and ex-NSAer, and I worked in tech, specifically doing machine learning and AI, using signal intelligence to surface, bad actors, as I refer to. And whether that's counterterrorism or combating children's sexual exploitation or spam, and it could be applied and implied in many other segments. And from there, we went on to create and participate in this tech coalition, because this is a non-competitive space. We want to share as much as we can to move fast and address those issues as they come on. I have a Master's of Science in Entrepreneurship and Innovation from the University of San Francisco, and I'm a doctoral candidate in business as of last month. And 3 weeks ago, I had the honor of joining Vets in Tech, a nonprofit organization, as COO. So really excited to be here. And I do quite a bit of work in the policy space as well. I'm the president of Veterans Affairs Commission. We have been able to pass 3 legislations, working on the 4th one right now, specific to veteran preference for affordable housing in San Francisco. I can go on, but really excited to be amongst all of you geniuses and experts in the field, and happy to contribute. Thank you.
Thank you. Christina, would you give us your background?
Yeah,
with BlueSpace.
Yeah, sure. Good morning from California. I'm having my coffee, waking up slowly, and I'm co-founder and president of BlueSpace.ai. We're based out of Emeryville, a few blocks from Pixar Studios. We are AV, autonomous vehicle software provider, and we've been in the space and from different organizations, whether Zoox, Cruise, Waymo, and others. And we started BlueSpace with an insight that while DL, ML, deep learning machine learning, which is synonymous with AI these days, although AI is a lot broader than that, isn't the only tool that will get us to the finish line. In fact, there has to be another way to give us that accuracy and certainty to apply this, to protect the personnel and also the vehicles, and to really commercialize at scale. I'll go into more of that later. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for that introduction. Dr. Coker, over to you.
Thanks, Ellen, and likewise. Very excited to be here. And my background is, so prior to this job, I spent 5 years in Europe as a science director for the research arm of ONR. And there I led the AI and the autonomy space, with particular emphasis on collective behavior and swarming. And now I'm in DC in ONR, and I am leading the Intelligent Autonomous Systems portfolio, which is basically our attempt to, not our attempt, but our vision to look at the intersection of AI and autonomy. And I know Ellen had mentioned that they're distinct. So they're distinct, but they are also complementary, right? And so they're also intertwined, because for us to achieve the true potential of autonomy, we have to inject some kind of intelligence. So autonomy, if you look at it from a high level, is a set of rule-based behaviors, right? And we can't determine all those behaviors. So in order to cross that cavern into having platforms that can operate in complex environments, we have to infuse them with intelligence. And if we project into the future and we look and we try to determine and try to predict what the future conflict or battlefield is going to look like, it's going to be our intelligence against their intelligence, right? So it's going to be a chess match. It's not going to be a fixed platform. It's going to be a many-body system with complexities and emergent behaviors. And so it's incumbent upon us to identify what those gaps are in our autonomous platforms are, how we can infuse more intelligence into them, and how we can get to that endpoint so that we are still competitive on the battlefield field. So that's kind of where we're looking at the natural progression of autonomy, which is moving into the intelligence space, and how we can think about AI infused into autonomy as rather than just a mismatch of adding perception or machine learning here and there, but how can we think of it as from the ground state up, all right, at the beginning, not just when we get to a bottleneck or to a hole, we say, okay, maybe we can close the gap with machine learning, or we can sprinkle some AI dust on it. No, you need to think at the beginning how to inject AI into the construct and how to have these systems function in complex environments. So that's kind of the area I lead. I don't want to over.
Thank you for that. So with the backdrop of everyone's backgrounds, I'm going to start with the first question, and it's really around the state of autonomy. Each of you come from different backgrounds, so maybe you're going to answer this question differently. But what we're trying to get at is, how do we think of autonomy? Personally, I have personal experience with autonomous systems. I spent 12 years with Northrop Grumman working on several of their autonomous systems. I still feel that the systems were pretty brittle. You had to actually provide a lot of commands to them. And certainly on the flip side, Elon Musk is really concerned about autonomous things taking over, right? So I think the truth is in between, or is in the middle somewhere. So maybe I'll start off with you experts. What's the state of the autonomy in your minds? And maybe Christina, you can answer that, and what also with what you're trying to do and what you're trying to solve with BlueSpace.
Sure, I'll start. I like the word you use, brittle. I think it is brittle the way it is, and we need a better solution. And when we want to, us operating these vehicles or relying on these autonomous vehicles, if we want to use that software, we better trust it and have the confidence that it will outdo human level performance. And that's where BlueSpace, applying the current state of AI or DLML training approach, is that the software is only as good as the data. And I think there's been cases where, in the early days of AI, when you train the system, hey, this is a person, this is a cat, this is a dog, this is okay, well, it's a person. And then let's go down to a sub bullet. Okay, this is what a president looks like. Well, if you look at the historical data, presidents are only men. So does that mean that a president can't be a woman? So will it not recognize a female president to be a president? I'm just using that as an example. So what I'm saying is that relying on data alone, historical data, always lends to edge cases, or quoting Elon Musk back, long tail of small problems. And I think what that means is that the edge cases, safety critical or time critical edge cases, cannot be relied on with the existing approach. So if you were to ask, well, what are you doing about it, BlueSpace? What we're doing about it is we're taking a different approach to AI or to autonomy, and that is math and physics-based approach. And I will later on have a chance to show you what that means in a real world context. What you need is a scalable solution that works anywhere, not just in a defined space of few blocks radius of a city, because that doesn't happen for military. You're operating in places where three things matter: latency, fast time to react, and then two, where you may not have mapping data, so you don't have situational awareness necessarily. And then three, you may not have enough training data, let alone a good training data. So in response to those three challenges that exist here on Earth, also in space, that's why BlueSpace was selected by NASA as the winner for the iTech Challenge last year. And we need generalizable and reliable and scalable, not just something that works in a geofenced area. I'll pause there.
Thank you for that. General Shanahan, how about you, since you're on several of the committees and also are looking at it from maybe a national security perspective? How do you define it?
Well, I'd agree with what you said, Ellen, and what Christine said. And Christine said the word that I would always come back to in these discussions, and that's trust. Do we trust these systems or not? And as a sort of a subset of this idea of trust, when we talk autonomous systems, we tend to get very general and very broad, but we really need to be thinking about what functions are we talking about and what's the level of autonomy in a given system. We've done various kind of autonomous systems in the military for many years, but we're looking at a very different future, especially when we start talking AI-enabled autonomy. So the progression is happening. I would agree that the state of the art is not particularly advanced right now, with some exceptions, right? I can protect a ship with a gun that I can put that into autonomous mode and protect that ship very well. But that's sort of one piece of a much bigger problem. And what Christine said is, to me, in addition to trust, the challenges come in the form of the edge cases, those long tails. They're really hard to get at, as we saw with in Project Maven in particular. You think you can have all the data in the world, but you didn't have data for this one condition. Until we solve that part of it, autonomous systems will have limitations to them. So to me, this is about focusing on the differences of autonomous systems for the next decade versus the things that we've worked on all the way up into this point. There are a lot of similarities. I don't know what the right number is. I think somewhere around 80 to 90% of the systems have a commonality with the past that we don't have to change a whole lot, but that final 10 to 15% will absorb 95% of all of our time trying to figure out exactly how to get that right. And I don't think the United States is, we don't have any hubris here. I think every country is working their way through this, include China and Russia. We're seeing development of systems very, very quickly. I saw a story this morning about a synthetic aperture radar that China is putting on a very small scale drone system. Size, weight, and power is being solved almost as we speak. A long way to go. But so my thought is it is a little brittle still, but it's also advancing very quickly.
Gotcha. I guess maybe if I could just take a pivot off the question then, how, we're talking about edge cases and essentially some of these aspects that cause us to maybe not trust it. So where should we point our thoughts or research? Maybe Deji, are you able to help us with that? How are you thinking about the portfolio and what types of problem areas are you looking at?
So that's a difficult one, right? Because I'll say this, right? So I agree with the brittle statement, right? It is brittle, and we're not at the beginning necessarily. We're almost at the end of the beginning, so to speak, right? So autonomy is still in. So I have kids, so I'm going to use children analogies. So it's still in grade school, right? And we're still trying to understand this. So the systems are still trying. We're still trying to really determine the potential of these systems. And when we look at the research and the emerging technology space, it's not linear, right? Technology is not moving in a linear fashion. They're moving in very, very at different speed and different rates. And compute power is increasing rapidly, right? Our ability to sense things, our ability to gather copious amounts of data, but we don't have the ability to have great insight into what that data tells us, right? So there's no true context-aware data analysis. So that's one gap, right? And then we're still trying to determine what we want the systems to be, right? So we have many schools of thoughts here. We have one school of thought that thinks that this should be a godlike system. So when we talk about it, we're like, this is going to solve everybody's problems, but that's not the truth, right? We can't ask these systems more than we ask of ourselves, essentially. That should almost be our benchmark, all right? And because we are imperfect creatures creating systems, these systems are not going to be perfect, flat out. So we now go to the problem of trust, right? So when you put a warfighter on the battlefield, you trust them, but they also have emergent behaviors. Different things are coming at them, but you trust that when you train them in the right way, that they will react in the right manner, given all these complexities. So that's the way that, at least from my standpoint, we should be approaching AI, infusing it into autonomy, is we should expect of them what we expect of the warfighter for now, but we should also expect them to be able to, at real time, analyze data that humans are cognitively unable to analyze at machine speed, and then get insights from them and then react. And also, they should be great partners to the warfighter. So if we think about human-machine teaming, starting from there, and then thinking, when do we need to hand up to the machine, and what safeguards do we need to imbibe in them so that they go to the human for those decisions that the humans need to jump into. And and I'll step back. You don't necessarily want all types of humans. There's certain people you don't want making decisions anyway, right? So it's a many-body problem. So we're still in its infancy, and we're still trying to determine where we want technology to go. But one of the key areas that we know we want it to go is we want context-aware data analysis, right? We don't want an unmanned systems or an uncrewed system out in the ocean, right, in the maritime environment, collecting terabytes of data. You want it to do what a seaman will do, which is only notify his commander or whoever it is when there is something of interest. You don't want to have 10,000 people sitting over terabytes of information to just glean one little bit of input. You want the system to only alert you. So we start from there. Then we start from having the machine identify things that would typically take us a long time to string together, right? That what is the adversary doing? What is the integration of all this? So the way things are approaching us, could only lead to one outcome, right? This is things that we expect of a veteran, of someone who's an operator that has been in the field for a long time. And they call that a gut feeling. It's not a gut feeling. It's basically the system has been trained over a wide array of different scenarios and has now cued itself on certain parameters that allows them to act anytime they see a certain situation. So those are the gaps that we're missing, right? Is how do we analyze data in real time? How do we string together potential outcomes? And how do we react? And we also need to think about the platform itself, right? The platform needs to be agile. We have to move away from big, bulky mobile system, the things that are quick, things that move in concert, right? So you take a look at nature. Nature succeeds because you have this collaborative distributed autonomous function in swarming. And when you see swarms of entities, they don't talk to each other, but they move in unison. They look at the nearest neighbors, they look at the behavior, and then they react as a whole team in real time. Nobody is saying, hey, are you going right or left? No, I want to go straight. No, you see, look at a swarm of birds of memorization and look at the way they function. So that's kind of where we want to get to. And those are where the research gaps are. How do we do collaborative distributed autonomy, infusing AI into it? How do we do it with least amount of communication? And how do we do it in a way where we're able not to gather copious amounts of information, but only the information that we need to react at the time we need to? So that, in a broad sense, is where I think we need to be going in that space.
With that, I'm going to go to Ikram. So you approach things from a security perspective. Hearing this conversation, I mean, what thoughts do you have around the security aspects of this?
My heart is racing. I from like even a policy perspective security issue, we're in this era of cyber wars. It's red flags everywhere. I think every single one of the panelists have touched on major gaps and issues, major concerns like the diversity, the analyzations of the data, real time and analysis, and moving, in an agile way. And what comes to mind in terms of additional issues is like policy-wise, we're always so far behind, right? Like we could never really catch up. That's not like moving real time. It's in my opinion, we're like 10 years behind in terms of policy and how we can address certain things. And certain actors really take advantage and exploit these areas before we can actually address it at a federal level or state level. Then we leave so much to the entrepreneurs, and I know like we have amazing entrepreneurs here, but we leave so much ethics wise, we leave so much up to the entrepreneur as well. So, discussing privacy and so on. Now, moving on to like the operations of these systems, I think ultimately, would we want to see these things like operating on its own at a high, like super accuracy rate? Sure, yes, absolutely. Like we all want that. But realistically, we need to use these systems as enhancements, as guidons and guides to tier things, flag things in real time again, and really like have processes in place and workflows in place to where something gets flagged, this is the approach I need to go, or that's the other approach I need to go. So these are things, but that's also like in one way or another, it's either machine learning, it could be AI, or it could be, autonomous systems. So, or it could be a combination of all. And I will pause right there.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I like the way how you talked about maybe gaps, right? And some, how the policy is actually a little bit slow to react. And I'm just curious, maybe there's ways we collectively here can think about it to anticipate, how do you push policy to shift in order to be flexible enough to allow for innovation to happen, but and not slow it down, but at least continually push us to be more secure. I'm going to move on to this other question that we have around, it's around experimentation. So Deji, you talked about testing these systems, and generally our typical approach to testing is, here's what it should do, did it do that, right? And when you have emergent systems, you really can't predict what it will do. At least 4 or 5 years ago, we weren't sure how we would test autonomous systems. And so this is to everybody. So I'm curious if the test approach has, if thought around test has shifted, has advanced. Do we have a better idea of how we recognize whether a system is doing the right thing or not without going requirement by requirement by requirement? So Deji, over to you first.
Yeah, so testing is key here. Well, let me slightly move to the other thing that I think Ikram mentioned, which is the policy and ethics of the systems, right? So that's part of my portfolio, and that's one area that we're really looking at. And when it comes to policy and ethics, it's not a nice to have, right? It's a necessity, right? We can't let the systems go out there unhinged, right? And because if we look at the ethical construct from a scientific perspective, this allows us to enhance the systems the way we need to. It allows us to create systems that understands the human operators and allows the human operators to understand the systems. So when we talk about gaps, so natural language processing, for example, is a gap. So we need to be able to talk to these systems, not in ones and zeros, not in text or anything, the way we're having a conversation right now, right? How do we do that so that when we talk to the system, it responds to us in real time and we understand what the system potentially might be doing? Because emergent behaviors are the key, right? We can't erase them because we can't understand everything that's in front of us because we have too much information coming at us. So we need to be able to let the systems take decisions, but we also need to be able to trust the systems enough to allow them. And so this opens up gaps. What is trustworthiness? What safeguards do we need to put in them? And how do we create technologies that allow us to create a Jarvis, right? So you go with Iron Man and you see him working quickly, right? And in the lab, tell me that's what you want to have at the end of the day, because that helps the operator, but it also helps us in the defense and security space, right? Even for academia, trying to accelerate the scientific discovery process, to have an AI system that you can communicate with in real time so that you don't have to stop doing the flow of innovation to Google something or read a paper. You can quiz the system gives you the right information, and then you move. But to your point about experimentation, that is also going to be key, all right? So that's another huge gap because we need to be able to train the systems quickly, but we don't have the right amount of training data to do that, right? So what is the gap there? Is how do we jump that hoop, right? And full disclosure, I did listen to, so I had a call with BlueSpace yesterday, and so they're one of the companies that are trying to close that gap, all right? But so that's one gap that we need to close. How do we quickly train a system? How do we do this in a way? And we have to look at it. So I think this is one area that is not emphasized enough, is Mother Nature has given us enough information to rely on, but we rely on ourselves, right? So you look at look at insects, you look at humans, like you look at a baby and how quickly a baby is able to understand from a few pictures what an elephant is and is able to extrapolate, or a cat, extrapolate over multiple variations of that object. That's one. And then when we talk about larger experimentation, we need to be doing it in a way that removes us from this Groundhog Day approach, which is, and this is not just Navy, this is across the board, and maybe to a certain extent industry, right? Where we just want to go out there and try something out, right? That's good, but that's shooting darts and it's expensive and it doesn't help us innovate quickly. So you need to be able to figure out a way where we can, in a virtual space, not find the answer, but gain insights, first level insights, back up the envelope analysis, so that we can figure out the potential candidates that we want to extrapolate on. That's the direction that we need to go in the experiment. So for the Navy side, what that means is before we go into any large water exercise, that we should iteratively, on the autonomous behavior side and the AI side, try to figure out what we have in front of us and how they mesh together, and then go out there. So it's more of that scientific process of you make an observation, you hypothesize over that observation, and then you create an experiment to verify, validate that behavior, knowing full well that it will fail, all right? And then you have to go back to tuning your hypothesis. So it's an iterative process that is too expensive to do in the water. So we go to the virtual space, create our plan, and then instead of shooting darts in the water, we go and try to deliberately verify the hypothesis that we got from the data. That way, I think we advance the ball further on the experimentation side. If we don't do that, what happens with each experimentation event is that people change, enough data is not collected, and every time it's approached as something new, all right? And then after we spend a few $1 million, we go, That's why that guy did it that way. Okay, if I get another bite of the apple, I'll do it this way. So we need a way to erase that, to collect the right amount of data, to analyze it, to test it out in a virtual construct, and then more deliberately plan experiments. That's the way we advance the ball quickly on the AI and autonomy space. And also on the data side, we need to be able to figure out how to jump that cavern of requiring terabytes of information to train one system. All right, and so that's one area that we're looking as a gap. What do we need to invest in so that we're able to rapidly train a system?
Yeah, maybe we have to look at the problem differently too.
Yeah.
So I'm going to move over to Christine because she, you're building systems. You're probably figuring out how to test them. How do you know when you're done? I don't know. So, and I think you have a YouTube for us. Do you want to try to share?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly have a little preamble to the video. I think solving it is a very difficult problem, solving autonomy. We're just getting started, like you said, maybe end of the beginning, or yeah, that's right. And I think we solve it by dialogues like this. So thank you, Ellen and Andre, for hosting this. And it has to happen between private and public sector partnership. And there's a shortage of experts in autonomy. So the fact that we can share that across the verticals, across private and public sector is very important. And the trust is built when we have redundancy, meaning what's the plan B? What's the backup? Just like airplanes have a backup to a sensor. If a sensor were to fail, there's a backup to that sensor. I would argue from the software perspective, if software A fails, which is the brain or operating the vehicle, well, there's better be a backup. And from that perspective, BlueSpace acts as an independent safety system. So I want to show you some of the recent testing that we've done. Many of you have seen autonomous vehicles on the road, depending on where you are. Maybe you've seen it through the media. Here in the San Francisco Bay Area, I see ton through Google, Apple, GM, Cruise, and so on. And the question is, and you can see it through YouTube as well, they always show you how well it's driving. But the question that's in the back of your mind is, okay, I see you've driven millions of miles. Well, I, as a consumer, as a parent, care about the mile that I'll be on with your vehicle. So you better handle the scenarios where unexpected things happen, right? And that's where you show through scenarios, which I'll show shortly. It's on a video right now, and through metrics. And the metrics that you should care about, I approach it from software perspective. AV system, the brain of the car, software brain of the car, perceives and then predicts the motion of the object and then does the motion planning. And the two metrics that would test the software from that perspective is accuracy. How well did you see it? How well did you predict the motion? And then latency, fast reaction time. How well did you react to that? So the video I wanted to share, if you can, do I play it or do you play it? Somebody play it?
I can play it. I'll play it right now.
Go for it. Yeah, so the way we've set it is we did the hard stuff first. What we determine as the edge case. So there's our vehicle, this is on ground, and there is that soft car coming at us. Well, guess what? We want to do this for all objects in all locations. It's not something that is geofenced. There's no training. As I said, training depends on the data. And this is our software perceiving the world. There's our software driving, and there's a car. So what we do is we, as again, math and physics based, we detect the subtle changes in motion, in this case, yaw, rotational. And based on that, we would give commands on the top where it says, hey, come to a stop. And then on top, you see that we came to a safe stop. Here's a scenario that's being acted out. Okay, came at us, we stopped. Right? And that's not something we did based on training. We didn't say that was a car and that's a car, again, over multiple frames and come to a stop. We came to a stop seeing the motion first. And this is applicable in all areas. And that's what I would say as going back. How do you build trust? Well, make sure you have a backup plan, right? You can stop the video sharing. But the backup plan is if things were to fail, then what happens afterwards? And that's where I would say, hey, regulators, policymakers, and potential procurement officer, ask of the vendors that you work with, what metrics can you share? Don't just give me how many miles you've driven, because a mile driven on road A is very different from road B. City A, city B, ODD, operational design domain that your military personnel operates in, very different depending on where they may be. So I would say, hey, I will trust you, but I want to verify through the metrics that you provide, and let me assess. Even in the private sector, that we talk to different ecosystem players, especially insurance guys who are very data driven. They say they have two challenges. One, they don't have access to the software. And two, even if they were to have access to the software, they wouldn't know what to do with it. That's where having dialogues like this, talking about metrics that really matter, is really important.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really interesting. Maybe it's a different way to approach the problem, and it provides the total solution.
That's right.
More robustness to it.
That's right. So being open-minded about, hey, don't drink your own Kool-Aid that, DLML is the way to go. Be open about, hey, could there be another way to approach the same problem? Can those two approaches coexist to make it even more robust of an outcome?
Yeah, thank you for that. So for the audience, I'm going to encourage you to put questions in the chat just as we move into our audience Q&A portion. But while we're doing that, so General Shanahan, I'm going to come back to you around, having heard this discussion and the different roles that you play right now, what is the state of autonomy? How are we trying to advance it, especially around perhaps the testing area? I mean, with what Christina just showed, does that give you new ideas, or are these ideas already being discussed?
Well, if we start with trust as a sine qua non for autonomous systems, then to me, test evaluation, validation, verification has been more important than it's ever been before. There was a reason that when I stood up the JAIC, I stood up a T&E part of the JAIC, just for this very reason, just based on some of the lessons we learned out of Project Maven about what does it look like differently with an AI-enabled system than anything we're used to in the past. I think we've got to get the, I don't think, we know we have to get this right to have people begin to trust the systems. Now, if we really start talking escalation from sort of just autonomy to AI-enabled autonomous systems, it will be hard to test and evaluate every condition that you could expect in the operational world. So there has to be a mechanism to get those differences back in and change very quickly. A data management pipeline from real world data back into the system, recoded, model update, passed right back out to the field, like we see with autonomous vehicles that are doing today, with sort of this master command and control node passing software updates out. So a lot more needs to be done here. Part of the subcommittee I'm working on with IEEE. So we start what sounds like a relatively simple scenario. An underwater unmanned vehicle launches a weapon. Now, how it got there, okay, that's a separate story, but let's just say you're in that condition. Work that all the way back to when somebody decided to build that system, to when a policymaker decided to approve the deployment of that system. It turns out there are complexities along the way that I think most people are not thinking hard enough about. It really is complex. It's not an inordinate amount of complexity. I mean, we've done complexity in commercial world and the military forever. However, what we have to be very careful of is watching on these failure modes, because when they fail, they could fail in unexpected ways. And when I like to say, we look at this globally, not just the United States, but every country nationally, a failure for one is kind of a failure for all when it comes to setting back the future of autonomous systems and AI-enabled autonomy. So it's clear where the direction is pushing, but to what Dr. Coker said earlier, the idea of doing a lot more experimentation, what I would call wargaming, sort of more of a military term, but also some really robust test and evaluation. To Christine's point, that doesn't have to, we should not be caught into the old ways of doing business. We're probably missing some things that, in my opinion, you'll see some commercial companies come out with some groundbreaking ways of doing this that we're just not seeing right now. And so she gave an example of that, of maybe not relying on the standard ways of doing things, but that's what I think the big future is going to be. And it will be public-private partnerships in this. It will be the government working with commercial companies in a partnership, not us versus them. So it's a really interesting time, but I think T&E is probably we need to spend a lot more time thinking about the implications of how things could go wrong.
Yeah. So I'm going to invite the panelists. We have a Q&A area. There's several questions popping up in there. One I'm going to highlight right now. A key challenge was well articulated by Christine Moon. In principle, data-trained AI is inherently limited by the training data. So in principle, how do we get past this inherent limitation? What models and paradigms should we employ? It sounds like you looked at a physics-based approach. Do you have any other comments?
I think there are many ways folks are trying to figure out, well, how do I perfect it? I mean, mind you, we did MLDL before in our previous AV company, very effective tool. But I think we have to be, again, we even in the private sector have to be open to coexisting with another technology that can make it even more robust. And there's been innovation in hardware, just like we are relying on new types of sensors. So there are 3D sensors that's been used for the past 10 decades, but there are 4D sensors that give you not only XYZ positional data, but velocity as well. And that's where it gives you a key insight into thinking about how do you get to the motion really fast, the latency, the compute, lowering the compute power needs so that the military personnel out there can react fast and not be worried about the range. If you're using, electric vehicle, for example, that power drain could be a big issue as well. And I think this is where being open about not only what you've been doing, but other ways, whether it's hardware and software, is also a key to innovation and iteration cycle, doing it fast, right?
Thanks for that. Any other comments? If not, I'll move to the next question.
Yeah, I'll also make a quick comment about that, right? So we can coin the term, we can use the term physics-based model, right? But I think so it goes back to that human-inspired approach, right? So you can use ML and DL, yes. But you can also use something, you can also try to look at intelligence as adaptive, right? So that's what I see the BlueSpace model is doing, right? Is trying to understand the environment and trying to understand the constraints that if another body moves towards you and hits you, that's something you don't want, right? Maybe we can use ML and DL to figure out, okay, this is just a splash of water, or maybe it's a pillow. So the effects are going to be reduced, right? But they're complementary at the end of the day, right? The way the human works is that when something approaches your eye quickly shuts down. It's not trained on every on every piece of object that may possibly approach your eye, right? It shuts down. But if a feather is approaching your eye, right, there's a time to think you're like, yeah, I can take this hit, or no, I'm gonna. So it's reactionary, physics-based, right? Being that if a body approaches you, you react to that body, or it's also intelligence-based, where you understand what that body is and the potential impact of that body on you, and then you react, right? So going in one direction of using AI ML to solve everything is definitely not the approach, right? You have to look at a combination of different approaches. And at the end of the day, an intelligence system should have different suites of behaviors to tap from and to enhance the ability to function. So I think that's the approach that we should be going. So it's not either or, it's how does everything complement the system to enhance it.
It's Anne. Yeah.
I'll ask the next question from the audience. So someone asked, when trust is such a critical element to operational employment, if ML, AI, and HMT, and trust may be embedded differently within and between societies, how do you shape the AI to work within the essence of national culture?
Sure, I'll jump on that for a second. That's an excellent question, right? I think how do we define trust worldwide? We have different, we perceive things differently, we treat things differently. There are cultural differences to this. But I think what it comes down to is, are you going to use the system or not? And in that question, and then the answer, somebody may say, okay, I'll use it under these conditions, which is a little bit of a risk-based framework. So I think what we'll see is different countries approach this differently in terms of what risks they're willing to accept when systems fail. For the United States, one failure of an autonomous vehicle that kills one person, as we've seen in the past, sets back the industry for potentially years. In other countries, they may have a different view of what that means. And I hate to use this phrase. I'll use it for the purpose of illustration, like that's the cost of doing business. I think we'll see that in warfare in particular. Some countries will be willing to accept much higher levels of risk. What we don't want to have, I think it's important for all of us, is what we don't want to have is a race to the bottom in autonomous systems. How low can we go and how fast can we go low? What we want to do is elevate the conversation and say, here are the standards, the minimal acceptable level of risk that we should all accept. Like, we will not allow systems go out and target humans with no human intervention, something like that. Will we get agreement on that? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on what the question really is. But what we should expect is, to the questioner's the point here, is we'll look at this differently based on our sort of our national lens. But the answer should be, I hope, more universal than that, is there are some things that none of us should be willing to accept. Now let's talk about what that may mean.
Are there any other comments?
Go ahead, Dr. Deji.
So I'll just quickly add to that, right? So that's why I said policy and the ethics of developing the system is not a nice to have, right? It's a necessity because you can, so a country can strive to create a killer machine that's most effective and efficient, right? Then you're one cyber hacking away from that thing turning around, right? And being used against you. So there are costs and benefits to everything, right? But you have to be more deliberate. And the example I typically give is that the reason why, in my view, SpaceX is so successful is because they're risk averse, but they work in a different space, right? If I was running a program where I blew up a couple of rockets on the launch pad, I would have been shut down before I got a chance to try out what I've learned on the next one, right? So risk tolerance is a huge part of this, right? But in an environment where it's too costly and we don't have the ability to ingest that, is how do we flip that around and do more testing in a way that's, and it shouldn't be a race to the bottom, right? We shouldn't keep throwing darts, hoping that something will stick and taking the casualties as they come. There are better ways to do this. We just need to sit down and figure out how we can kind of narrow down the space or the aperture of the areas we're trying to target and then go. Because at the end of the day, if look at the movies, right? Look at it. So I call the RTD2 construct, right? You want your AI to follow you and understand your behaviors. And when you integrate that knowledge together, right? And then we have something that's culturally aware. And the last tidbit is, and I am very, very attuned to that culture-based approach to doing science because I'm leading, and I was leading in the UK, I led an AI for accelerating scientific discovery grand challenge. Right. And one of the biggest things that came up was that the way science was done in Japan was different from the way science was done in the US. The way knowledge was captured and reported was different. So how do we take that and enhance the scientific discovery process, right? Where an AI understands the scientist, regardless of their cultural background, and is able to report the science in the right way. That's not just beneficial from an S&T perspective, it's also beneficial from an interoperability perspective and different perspectives. So there are these core foundational problems that if we solve, percolate their way up or bubble their way up into the larger questions. So ethics is not a nice to have, it's a necessity, 100% necessity. Because if you don't do it right, it can come back and bite you. And the US is a partner of choice for one reason. We have those discussions, right? Secondly, we need to figure out a way to do more back of the envelope testing in a virtual or semi-intrusive construct. And we need to be able to, when necessary, not use broad strokes. A rocket blowing up is not killing a human because we're testing an autonomous platform, which is what it should be, right? So we shouldn't cast that to the same, we shouldn't assess that on the same level that we assess a system or a car, right, that runs into a barrier with a human in it and kills a human. You can't use those two systems. You can't compare those two failures, right? So, but we have policies that basically cast a wide stroke over everything. A car that blows up with nobody in it and a car that blows up with someone in it. So I think we need to be more deliberate about the policies and the way we implement them. Sorry, Ikram, you can jump on that one.
You've touched on all of it really, like so far. Like I just want to recap certain things that all of you experts have mentioned in terms of the only way moving forward is really through MSP, so multi stakeholder partnerships. And then what does localization? So like that's a term we use in terms of businesses going into other countries, like because 10 years ago with so many case studies, like we would just go and force and shove down, cultures the American way, right? So localization is extremely important. And so what does that look like? Do we need to go toward globalization in general in terms of autonomy and build these systems from that standpoint? What does that look like and who's involved? Again, there's more questions than there are answers, and maybe we are on the right track, and this is like a great start of having these discussions. The team always beats the lone genius, and I think from personal experience, people are more than willing to listen, and also if you raise certain red flags or so on, they're ecstatic, like finding the right group of people that can move forward with these types of projects. And moving towards what a solution looks like, and then building out an MVP, a minimal viable product version of what this MSP would look like. would be like a fantastic pilot program, and just so that we move faster because of bureaucracy and the politics, as I refer to it. It gets really, it will take us another 10 years before we have like another collaboration on a global scale.
Well, Ikram, on that note about there being more questions and answers, sometimes I think that certainly necessitates more of these panels and conversations, which we're trying to do here. The next question that I'm going to ask from the audience is, what are current initiatives in ethics and trust in AI and ML? And what role is private industry playing in that discussion?
I think there's been, I can start with the comment. I think there's been increased awareness around, hey, and trying to be more open and getting consumers to experience it. So I think many private sector companies are trying to pilot, but I would argue it's not enough. It shouldn't be just the few who can experience, ADAS, like lower levels of autonomy through buying Teslas that, they get to experience it. It should be applied to even public transit, I would say. So they see the benefits of lower levels of autonomy and such that everyone could experience and see the benefit. I think it's like, if you think about elevators, even, there were operators initially to ease the uncertainty around stepping into this box that's supposed to take you up the stairs. And then there was that introduction of the stop or call button that would make people feel safer about, if I get stuck, who do I call out to? So there are definitely UI, UX things that we can do. But I think exposing the technology a little bit at a time in our day-to-day environment could be really good. And I think it should be equitable and accessible by many to build in that inherent trust, and then applying it to higher levels of autonomy. And I think that would be a good way to start. And I really do think this level of open dialogue, so people can listen in, ask questions, sort of like a town hall meeting, but open to all, is something that would educate many folks as well.
And Andre, what I'll add to that, maybe even in a slightly different direction of this, is what we're seeing now is a deeper interest in this idea of responsible, ethical, lawful use of these systems in the government and in commercial industry, because of some things that have really gone wrong over the past few years. So the interest level is high and getting higher, and there will be a lot of work that needs to continue to get done in this area. But what it underscores is something I've been thinking about now for several years, after having done this in the government and now doing some things on the outside. We have these different communities, technologists and sort of policymakers, policy leaders, each looking at the world in very different ways. Technology being put out for technology's sake without an understanding of the implications for society changes. The people approving or disapproving these technologies don't understand enough about the technology to make really well-informed decisions. Those are two circles that need to come together in a Venn diagram where each understand more about what's happening, why it's happening, and the impacts on not only society, say US society, but globally, because these will have implications and ramifications worldwide instantly once these things start becoming sort of fielded at scale. So what it means is a better understanding of sort of where each community is coming from. And I think we'll be back to square one with AI, is the philosophers will have the most to add to the conversation sometimes, as opposed to the technologists.
So as I'm going to try to squeeze in one last question in there, Lieutenant General Shanahan, you mentioned those communities. And of course, as we advance in this field, we're going to try to build up those communities. And a big part of those communities is certainly talent. So in general, to the panel at large, what do you think that the next generation of engineering students needs to study? Are they going to be specialists, or are they going to be generalists, or something else?
So let me try to answer that. I think from my standpoint, so let me step back a little bit. So my response to this question comes from the fact that, so a lot of performers we have, researchers that we fund or resource, right? They are basically, biologists trying to moonlight as computer scientists by injecting ML into it, because we don't have the right tools that allow them to, without being a computer scientist, integrate intelligence into their research. So I think it's not necessarily trying to get generalist, but it's trying to get the right tools and trying to figure out a way where the computer scientists can work with the subject matter experts, with the biologists, with material engineers, with the physicists, so that they can produce the solutions rather than half-baked solutions that were developed with someone trying to read a machine learning textbook and trying to implement some coding to demonstrate their research solution. So it needs to be a combination of both, right? So we need to have we need to create tools that allow the specialists to demonstrate these AI techniques, deep learning techniques, neural nets, whatever it is, into their science without being specialists. And we need to figure out a way that, and this already happens organically, but it's very loose, where everything is multidisciplinary, right? Where you work with but people are trying to save money all the time. So you find it where they just hire one, undergrad to code something up for them. And then you don't have something that we don't really figure out the true veracity of that research outcome, because they're trying to get to a minimum viable solution, so to speak, right? And another thing is that we already do this in science, right? Where there's a race to publish. So someone will publish, and this wastes a lot of time, right? Because as a grad student, you read a publication, you're like, this is fantastic. Someone publishes, the solution that they find after 1,000 tries. They don't figure out why it failed 1,000 times. They published it one time, it succeeded. And then you have 10,000 other people failing 10,000 times. And this is happening in the AI space as well, because people are rushing to bring their products out because they don't want to be left behind. And so they're not truly testing the veracity of the systems. And so we have to figure out a way to create a balance where you can innovate quickly, contribute to the corpus of knowledge, let people, because we just have big dark matter solutions that's coming into literature. People are still innovating. So there needs to be a way where the AI companies, startups can publish or produce their solutions in a non-invasive way, where it's not detrimental to everyone, but they need to just crowdsource it so that we can all learn quickly and innovate. But we can't stop that. They need to keep getting out there.
I also want to add to that. I want to say the word diversity, just like the panel here today. When your mom or your daughter or your aunt gets into an accident, she's 47% more likely to get seriously injured, because the crash test dummies were based on an average male. And that's an example of lack of diversity. So whether it's hardware or software, when there's diversity in problem solving, approaching a problem, and the problem space itself, I think we get to the better outcome. So regarding your question about talent, I really do want to continue to maintain the great talent base that US presents because of its educational system, attracting talent from all over the world. And I hope that there are ways to continue to keep them here, because right now, there are limitations that we set in terms of H-1B cap visas and et cetera, such that we can continue to innovate here in the US.
Thank you for that. And with that, we're at the top of the hour, so we're going to pull the panel to the end. I messaged to the audience that we have several questions. We're going to try to get them answered over time. What we'll do with this is capture our video. We're going to send it out to everyone who registered and post it, and then we'll be in touch with the panelists to let you know what our next steps are. We want to continue the conversation. You might have others that you recommend that we talk to, and we're going to do a live session and then a couple podcasts, and then we'll have another live session, et cetera. So that's what we're trying to do. Thank you so much for joining us. This was a great start to a very, very important conversation. We look forward to seeing you out there. Thank you so much.
Likewise.
Bye.
Great meeting, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all.